Good day. Today lecture is skull as a whole, joint of the skull. The human skull consists about 22 to 30 single bones, which are mostly connected together by ossified joints, so-called sutures. The skull is divided into the brain scale, cerebral cranium, and the face visceral cranium. Its main task is the protection of the most important organ in the human body, the brain. The brain is almost entirely enclosed by the cerebral cranium, with the exception of the foramen magnum and other foramina at the skull base, which serve as entry and exit point for blood vessels and the cranial nerves. Also, the skull provides support for all of the facial structure. Key facts: function, protection of the brain, supporting of the facial structure, bonus cranial H bonus and facial 14 bonus. Anterior cranial fossa content frontal lobe of the cerebral cortex, olfactory bulb, olfactory tract, optic nerve, orbital gyri. Opening anterior ethmoid foramen, optic canal, cribriform foramina. Middle cranial fossa content trochlear, abducens, oculomotor, ophthalmic, maxillary, mandibular nerves, pituitary gland, internal carotid artery, temporal lobes of the brain. Opening superior orbital fissure, foramen rotundum, foramen ovale, carotid canal, foramen lacerum, foramen spinosum. Posterior cranial fossa content brainstem, facial, vestibular cochlear, glossopharyngeal, laryngeal nervus, vagus nervus, accessory hypoglossal nervus, internal jugular vein. Opening following formation: foramen magnum, internal acoustic meatus, jugular foramen, anterior condylar, hypoglossal canal. Component and features: the brain case consists of the skull cap, calvarium, and the skull base. The skull cap is made up of the pairs of parietal bones and part of the frontal bone, as well as the occipital bone. The most important sutures in the human skull are the coronal suture between the frontal and parietal bone, the sagittal suture dividing both the parietal bones, the lambdoidal suture running horizontally between the occipital bone and both parietal bones. These are the three most significant of all 33 sutures which are formed by the human skull bones. It is figure. You see coronal suture and sagittal suture. This lambdoid suture between temporal and two temporal bones and the occipital bones. Component and the features. The skull base is the caudal boundary of the cerebral cranium. Looking at it from the inside, it can be subdivided into the anterior, middle, and posterior cranial fossa. The skull base comprises part of the frontal ethmoidal sphenal, occipital, and temporal bones. The face is referred to as all skull bones, frontocaudally connected to the cerebral cranium. Prominent representatives are the maxilla, upper jaw, and the mandibular, lower jaw. The orbita and the nasal cavity are formed by the zygomatic nasal, palatinal, lacrimal bones, the vomer and inferior nasal concha, lower turbinate. Foramina and contents. Most foramina in which relevant nerves and blood vessels pass through are located at the base of the skull. In the following, the most important structures are discussed, ordered by their location in the three cranial fossa. Foramina and the contents. Anterior cranial fossa. The anterior cranial fossa comprises a hollow plate at the center to the callet cribriform plate, lamina cribrosa. The approximately 20 cribriform foramina serve as a passageway for the olfactory nerves to the olfactory mucosa in the nasal cavity. Both the optic nerves and the ophthalmic artery pass through the optic canal. This optic canal, which is centrally located on the sphenoid bones. The lesser wing of the sphenoid bone, ala minor, this ala minor, its suture is limited. Ala minor forms the dorsal boundary of the anterior cranial fossa. Middle cranial fossa lies slightly deeper than the anterior cranial fossa. The superior orbital fissure between two wings situated superior orbital fissure, which is bounded by the greater and the lesser wings of the sphenoid bone, contains the trochlear nerves, abducens nerves, 4-pair nerves, 6-pair nerves, and 3-pair nerves, oculomotor nerves, and ophthalmic nerves. The sella turcica, or body of sphenoid bones, sella turcica is a depression in the sphenoid bone in the center of the middle cranial fossa. It is formed the pituitary fossa, in which the pituitary gland sits. Few the important foramina are the foramina rotundum, little more rounded, foramina rotundum, foramina ovale, and the carotid canal. This foramina rotundum, foramina ovale, and the carotid canal. Okay, superior orbital fissure between two wings. Posterior cranial fossa, the largest opening in the skull, in the foramina magnum. Here the brain stem leaves the skull and it becomes the spinal cord. The foramina magnum is situated in the center of the posterior cranial fossa. It is separated from the middle cranial fossa by the dorsum sella and the upper edge of the petrous bone. This posterior surfaces of petrous bone. Few important structure are the internal acoustic meatus. What this internal acoustic meatus goes through to facial nervus or exiting facial nervus, vestibulocochlear nervus, jugular foramen. Here, jugular foramen goes through internal jugular vein, glossopharyngeal nerve, vagus nerves, and accessory nerves. Hypoglossal canal goes through to hypoglossal same nerves. Foramen magnum, and this is meatus acousticus internus, foramen jugularis. Okay, hypoglossal canal, canalis nervum hypoglossalis. This more good showing external basal surfaces. Anterior frontal valve. The frontal bone of the found superiorly, while the mandible lies inferiorly, giving the skull on a void shape when looked at anteriorly. The frontal bone underlies the forehead above the orbital cavities, the nasal bridge, which is formed jointly by the two nasal bones, and the frontal processus of the zygomatic bone. The two maxillary bones, the occipit most of the scape in the middle part of the facial skeleton. Together with the nasal bones, they form the boundaries of the anterior nasal aperture nasalis, inferiorly the mandible and alveolar processus, inferiorly mandible and alveolar processus of the maxilla bonus form the lower part of the anterior skull. Lateral side. On the lateral side, you see lateral aspect of the skull can be divided the three regions: the face, temporal, and the occipital regions. Face regions already now. The temporal region we will cover in detail in this section. The occipital region. The temporal region is subdivided by the zygomatic arch into the temporal fossa and the infratemporal fossa. The frontal bone, the parietal bone, the greater wings, the frontal bone, the parietal bone, the greater wings, the greater wings of the sphenoid bones and the squamosa part of the temporal bone meet at the pterion, forming the floor of the temporal fossa. Posterior valve. The posterior aspect of the skull is formed by the parietal bones, supralaterally, the temporal bone infralaterally, okay, and the occipital bone centrally. Temporal bonus, parietal bonus, and central part, occipital bonus. And you see this Hodges nuclear line, external occipital protuberans occipitalis externa, occipital condyle, mastoid foramen, you see, pterygoid process of sphenoid bonus, and the mandibular foramen. And sagittal suture, lambdoid suture, superior nuclear line, inferior nuclear line, palatina bonus, palatina processus of maxilla, and incisura foramen. You see this superior valve. From above, we can see the ellipsoid shaped part of the skull called the calvaria. It is formed by four bones: the frontal bones, the two parietal bones, and the occipital bones. The coronal suture between frontal and parietal bones. Lambdoid suture between the occipital and the parietal bones. It is lambdoid suture. And the sagittal suture between the two parietal bones. Base of the skull. I am repeat two because as a lecturer I am give information too. Base of the skull, inferior valve or inner or external base of skull, external surfaces. The base of the skull extends from the superior nuchal line of the occipital bonus, posteriorly to the upper incisors teeth anteriorly. This aspect of the skull contains a lot of important structures, including the largest skull of foramen, the foramina magnum, anterior part of the hard palate and the upper jaw, middle part, the sphenoid bones, Petrosa processus or Petrosa part of the temporal bones, and the basilar part of the occipital bones. Lateral part, the zygomatic arches, mandibular fossa, tympanic plate, and the styloid and the mastoid processus. Posterior part, the occipital bones. Skull joints. The bones of the skull are highly irregular. Most of the bones of the skull are held together by firm, immovable fibrous joints, called sutures, or synarthrosis. These joints allow the developing skull to grow both pre and postnatally. The suture of the skull are morphologically distinct, being divided into three main groups based on the margin of the articulating bones. At a simple suture, the margins of the articulating bones are smooth and meet end to end, such as the median palatinal suture. A bilvillate suture is where the border of the bone overlaps that of the other, like the parieto-temporal suture. Conversely, the borders of the bones may have a number of the projections that interdigitate with each other, devying the serrated appearance, such as in the sagittal suture. The complexity of the serration of the suture increases from internal to external. Key fact about skull joints and the suture. Posterior valve lambdoid suture, superior valve coronal suture and the sagittal suture, and lateral valve pterion, squamous, perietosquamastoid, sphenoparietal, sphenofrontal, sphenozygomatic, frontozygomatic, temporozygomatic, and the occipitomastoid. Anterior valve intermaxillary, zygomatica maxillary, frontonasal, nasomaxillary, internasal, frontomaxillary, frontolacrimal, in the lacrima maxillary. Base of skull, median and the transverse palatina suture, spheno-occipital synchondrosis, petra-occipital suture, petra-sphenoidal suture. Posterior valve, occipito-mastoid suture. And the synovial joints, atlanto-occipital and temporomandibular joint. The joint of the base of the skull are largely cartilaginous joints or synchondrosis. One such joint is the spheno-occipital synchondrosis, which is found between the body of the sphenoid anteriorly and the basilar part of the occipital bone posteriorly. There are only two areas on the skull where synovial joints are present. The first is a pair of joints, the temporomandibular joints, where the mandible articulates with the skull on either side. The second synovial joint is the atlanto-occipital joint, where the base of the skull articulates with the vertebra columna. Posterior valve. The lambdoid suture can be found between the posterior border of the parietal bone and the anterolateral border of the occipital bone. It is named so due to the lambdoid shape it forms with the coronal suture. It extends from the posterior extremity of the sagittal suture in a posterior inferior direction to meet the occipitomastoid suture from behind and the parietomastoid suture from above the mastoid process. Superior valve. The coronal suture between the posterior border of the frontal bone and the anterior margin of the left and the right parietal bone. It is projected inferiorly to meet the junction of the greater wings on the sphenoid bone and the squamosa part of the temporal bone. The sagittal suture runs in the middle line separating the left and the right parietal bones from each other. It extends from the coronal suture anteriorly to the lambdoid suture posteriorly. The junction between the sagittal suture and the coronal suture is an area called the bregma and was once a membranous portion of the developing skull called the anterior fontanelle. Lateral valve. The pretion is an H-shaped region on the lateral aspect of the skull where a number of bones unite with each other. Participants of the pretion are the frontal bone, the parietal bone, the greater wing of the sphenoid bone, and the anterior of the squamous part of the temporal bone. Consequently, a number of sutures converge at the area. The sphenoparietal suture separates the superior surface of the greater wings of the sphenoid bone from the parietal bone above. The coronal suture joins the sphenoparietal suture superiorly, the sphenofrontal suture anteriorly, the sphenoesquamosa suture inferiorly, and the squamous suture posteriorly. Due to the extensiveness of the articulation at the pretion, this portion of the skull weaker than other part, and therefore more vulnerable to fracture. The sphenoesquamous suture is a vertical suture between the anterior margin of the squamous part of the temporal bone and the posterior margin of the greater wings of the sphenoid bone. The squamous suture is a large horizontal suture that curves inferiorly as it passes toward the posterior aspect of the skull. It extends from the pterion anteriorly in a posterior-inferior fashion to meet the parietomastoid suture. It separates the superior and the posterior borders of the squamous part of the temporal bone from the posterior-inferior angle of the parietal bone. The parietomastoid suture lies between the inferior border of the angle of the parietal bone posteriorly and the mastoid processes of the temporal bone. This suture is another common site for sutural bones to form. The sphenoparietal suture is the articulation of the superior margin of the greater wings of the sphenoid bone and the parietal bone at the angle formed by the convergence of the coronal and squamous suture at the pterion. The sphenoparietal suture separates the coronal and squamous suture from each other and at this point. The sphenofrontal suture is an obliquely oriented suture extending anterior-inferiorly between the lower margin of the frontal bone superiorly and the upper margin, the greater wing of the sphenoid bone inferiorly. The frontozygomatic suture is a horizontal suture lateral to the orbit. It lies between the frontal processes of the zygomatic bone inferiorly and the zygomatic processes of the frontal bone superiorly. There is a palpable depression at this suture. The sphenozygomatic suture is the joint between the posteromedial aspect of the zygomatic bone anteriorly and the anterior margin of the greater wings of the sphenoid bone posteriorly. The occipitomastoid suture is between the squamous part of the occipital bone and the mastoid processus of the temporal bone. It extends anterior-inferiorly toward the tip of the mastoid processus. The tempora zygomatica suture is a vertical suture located just superior to the coronoid processus of the mandible and inferior to the greater wings of the sphenoid bone when the skull is viewed from the lateral aspect. It is the site of articulation between the zygomatic process of the temporal bone posteriorly and the temporal processes of the zygomatic bone anteriorly. The temporozygomatic suture completes the zygomatic arch. Anterior valve, the intermaxillary suture, which is located in the midline, is a vertical suture extending from the nasal aperture to the oral cavity below. It also extends posteriorly and can be viewed as a horizontal suture on the anterior part of the hard palate, joining the palatinal process of the maxilla together in the roof of the mouth. The intermaxillary suture is continuous with the median palatinal suture. The zygomatica maxillary suture is an oblique suture passing inferolaterally from the inferior aspect of the orbit, beginning just above the infraorbital foramen. It joins the thick, short zygomatic process of the maxilla and the zygomatic bone. The frontal nasal suture is located between the orbits on the superior aspect of the nose. It passes obliquely downward from the midline, separating the upper border of the nasal bone from the inferior border of the nasal part of the frontal bone. The internasal suture is a vertical midline suture extending in a superior to inferior direction along the bridge of the nose. It extends from the frontal nasal suture superiorly to the superior aspect of the anterior nasal aperture, where the internasal suture meets the frontal nasal suture. There is a clear depression called the nasion, which indicates the root of the nose. This depression is clearly visible on the surface. The nasomaxillary suture is a vertical suture located between the lateral border of the nasal bone and the medial border of the frontal processes of the maxilla. It is extends inferiorly from the junction of the frontonasal and the frontomaxillary suture superiorly to the lateral margin of the anterior nasal aperture. The frontomaxillary suture is an oblique suture between the frontal processes of the maxilla, which extends upward laterally to the lacrimal bone and is a nasal part of the frontal bone. It is continuous superiorly with the frontonasal suture. The frontolacrimal suture is a small horizontal suture located in the medial wall of the orbit. It separated the frontal bone above from the superior border of the lacrimal bone below. It is posterior lateral continuation of the frontomaxillary suture. The lacrimaxillary suture is located in the medial wall of the orbit. It extends inferiorly and anteriorly toward the inferior border of the orbit, separating the anterior border of the lacrimal bone from the maxilla. Base of skull. For descriptive purposes, the base of the skull is divided into anterior, middle, and the posterior region. I am repeating this. The anterior region of the base of the skull consists mainly of the hard palate forming the roof of the oral cavity. A midline suture, the median palatinal suture, runs anterior-posteriorly on the palate between the adjacent maxillary and palatine bones, separating the palate into right and left sides. It is continuous anteriorly with the intermaxillary suture. The transverse palatinal suture is a transversely passing suture extending across the palatine, separating the maxilla anteriorly from the palatinal bones posteriorly. The middle part of the cranial base extends from the posterior opening of the nares anteriorly as far as the anterior margin of the foramen magnum posteriorly. The sphena occipital synchondrosis is a cartilaginous joint that lies between the body of the sphenoid bone anteriorly and the basilar part of the occipital bone posteriorly. The petrooccipital suture extends from medial to lateral as far as the jugular foramen. It separates the jugular fossa on the petrous portion of the temporal bone from the jugular processes on the basilar part of the occipital bone. The petrosphenoidal suture is located between the petrous portion of the temporal bone and the infratemporal surface of the greater wings of the sphenoid bone. The groove for the pharyngotympanic tube is also located between these two areas. The apex of the petrous process doesn't extend anteriorly as far as sphena occipital suture, resulting in an opening called the foramen lacerum medially. Posterior, the occipitomastoid suture, as previously discussed, is located on the posterior part of the base of the skull. Synovial joints. There are two different synovial joints present in the skull. One of them is the atlanto-occipital joint. Atlanto-occipital joint. This is where the condyles on the inferior surfaces of the occipital bone articulate directly with the first cervical vertebra, the atlas. Flexion and extension of the skull occurs here, allowing the nodding motion of the head as in when we are saying yes. As with a synovial joint, a number of the ligaments stabilize the atlanto-occipital joint. These are the atlanto-occipital membranes. The posterior atlanto-occipital membrane extends from the posterior margin of the foramen magnum of the occipital bone to the posterior arch of the atlas. The anterior atlanto-occipital membrane extends from the anterior margin of the foramen magnum to the upper border of the anterior arch of the atlas. The second of the synovial joint is a pair of the joint located on the lateral side of the skull. These are the temporomandibular joints. Temporomandibular joints. They are the point at which the head of the mandible, also called the condyle, articulates with the mandibular fossa of the temporal bone of the either side of the skull. Between the condyles of the mandible and the mandibular fossa is the articular disc, a small piece of cartilage. This disc effectively divided the joint into two separate joints. The upper joint is between the mandibular fossa of the temporal bone and the articular disc, where side-to-side movement of the jaw excursion occurs. The lower joint is between the articular disc and the condyle of the mandible. This is joint and at which there is the hitch-like motion in opening and closing the mouth. All that. Thank you.